Every day I woke up and went to the pasture and looked for something to kill. Side means kill. Herbicide, insecticide, fungicide, pesticide. We can go on to homicide.
Right.
And I was looking for something to kill, and I was really, really good at it. And as a result, I had a great monoculture of cattle grazing a great monoculture of grass. And I thought it was beautiful. And when I gave up using the sides and quit looking for something to kill, my operation fell apart. All kinds of weeds came up in my pasture, and the cows didn't want them. So we solved that by adding sheep and later goats and later hogs and later rabbits, and it worked. We went from a monoculture and me looking for something to kill to a polyculture and me looking for a way to keep things alive. A very radically different approach.
That's rancher Will Harris. He's a pioneer in regenerative ranching, and he's author of the fabulous new book, A Bold Return to Giving a Damn. We're going to be talking to him in just a moment on today's episode. You're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. We're coming to you from the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. I wanted to give two shouts out. One is to the writer who worked with Will to get this book into the world. Her name is Emily Grieven, and she did such a great job taking Will's incredible ideas and turning them into just beautiful prose. And sometimes the folks who do this kind of work don't get acknowledged. So there you go. And the other is to our newest Patreon contributor, Diane Karp. Thank you so much, Diane. If you're listening and you want to support this program, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $3 a month, and it makes a big difference. Patreon.com/down-to-earth-planet-to-plate. Patreon is Patreon. You'll find us there. It's easy to sign up. And now for some quick announcements. Quivira Coalition has built out a busy spring workshop calendar of webinars and in-person events. There's a Meat Business Fundamentals 3-part webinar, an on-the-land gathering at Red Canyon Reserve near Magdalena, New Mexico, an aerated static composting demonstration in Cleveland, New Mexico, and more. Check out Quivira's events page at quiviracoalition.org/events. And Quivira is spelled Quivira. Quivira Coalition, American Grassfed Association, and Holistic Management International are excited to announce this year's Regenerate Conference. Save the date, November 6th through 8th in Denver, Colorado. This year's conference, Innovating for a Resilient Future, will interrogate and explore data, technology, information collection and sharing, ways of learning and knowing, and the myriad approaches to fulfilling our ecological roles. Go to regenerateconference.com to sign up for the mailing list to be notified when registration opens. All right, that's all we've got for announcements. Now to our program. I'm very happy to welcome to Down to Earth Will Harris. He's owner of White Oak Pastures, and he's author of the new book, A Bold Return to Giving a Damn, One Farm, 6 Generations, and the Future of Food. Welcome to Down to Earth.
Thank you very much for having me.
So your book is the story of your transition from industrial cattle ranching to regenerative farming on White Oak Pastures, which is in Bluffton, Georgia. It's your family's land going back to before there even was industrial agriculture in the first place. Tell us the history of your family's land and what kind of farming was going on there before you arrived.
So my great-grandfather came here in 1866. He had a farm about 50 miles north of here. And somehow during the Civil War, he was a cavalry officer for the South during the Civil War. He lost the farm. And I've had several different renditions of how that happened, and I don't know what's true, but he did lose the farm. He was very fortunate. He had an uncle who was a medical doctor here in Bluffton who started him over farming on our current land in 1866. And he farmed land all his life, followed by his son, my grandfather, who farmed it all his life, followed by his son, my dad, who farmed it all his life, followed by me. And I've been joined by 2 daughters and 2 in-laws, and I have 7 grandchildren. My grandchildren are very young. We have, to be sure, the 5th generation is entrenched, and we'll probably be farming it for another 20 or 30 years if we're lucky enough to do that, and possibly another generation after that.
What kind of farming were you doing on White Oak Pastures before? I mean, it had a slightly different name, but before the dawn of industrial agriculture. I mean, do you feel like you've gone full circle in some ways?
No, we've very literally gone full circle, and it was unintentional. I did not set out with the intent of going full circle, but my great grandfather and grandfather ran this farm from 1866 to 1945, in the 40s, probably 1945. And, I don't know much about the way they farmed in that era, except anecdotally what I've been told, family lore. But what I believe to be true is that and they farmed on a fairly large scale for that point, this place and that point in time. They and their employees, 6 days a week, woke up really early before day and slaughtered something. Now, something might have been a cow, it might have been a couple of hogs, it might have been 50 chickens, it might have been whatever they had, but it was a daily slaughter. They loaded whatever they slaughtered onto a mule-drawn wagon, and an employee came 2 miles up the road to Bluffton, Georgia. It's a little town I'm sitting in now. I think it had a population of about 500 in that era. And so distributed, sold whatever they had killed that morning. This is before refrigeration, before internal combustion trucks, cars, and it's before USDA inspection. A very different meat production system. My dad took over the farm post-World War II in 1945, and he was part of really industrializing the farm. Under his watch, it went from a polyculture of a lot of different species of animals to a cattle farm. My dad was always proud of the fact that he was an expert cattleman. He never would have said those words, but he was an expert cattleman, and was proud he had that knowledge of that single species instead of being the generalist that his dad and granddad were. But he ran the farm very successfully. I mean, we certainly weren't rich people, but by the time I inherited 1,000 acres of paid-for land, a really nice herd, about 700 mama cows. All I ever wanted to do was run the farm as an industrial cattle operation, just like my dad had done. That was my life's goal. My dad actually did not encourage me to do that. That's what I wanted to do. I went to the University of Georgia, graduated in 1976 with a bachelor's degree in animal science, came home and ultimately wound up running the farm as a very industrial cattle operation. I ran it that way until the mid-90s. In the mid-90s, I started moving away from that model. The excesses of that production model really titillated me as a very young man. By the time I was about 40 years old by then, and I really lost its luster. So I started moving away from it.
I mean, that's one of the things that's so interesting about this book. You have a number of kind of epiphanies where you look at something and see it through different eyes. And there was an epiphany that you had where you were loading your cows off to eventual slaughter and, feedlots and all of that. Describe that moment. What happened?
Yeah, that was an epiphany, and it came about fairly suddenly. I had started feeling some misgivings about the way I was managing the farm, the way I was making my living. It did not have to do with profitability. We certainly weren't rich people, but I paid taxes every year. We was a profitable farm, and then my standard of living was satisfactory. It was not opulent, but it was satisfactory. but I was just enjoying it less. And one morning, I was loading up a semi of calves that I had raised. A double deck semi will hold 50,000 pounds of beef, maybe nearly 50 head if they're 500 pounds or approaching 500 pounds. And I was loading that big load of cattle, which I'd done many, many, many times in my life and enjoyed it. And that day, it just wasn't much fun. The idea of those cattle being on that truck for 30 hours with no food or water or rest, and the ones on top urinating and defecating on the ones on the bottom, just suddenly seemed very wrong to me, even though I'd done it a lot. And I, at that moment, started moving away from that model. I couldn't do it all at once, but I did it fairly rapidly. And 25 years later, I'm still moving, almost 30 years now, I'm still moving away from it.
What did you actually do? And I mean, it seems like there weren't very many people doing this kind of work. Did you have anyone to look to? Were you kind of inventing it as you went along?
That's a great question. And today, there are so many people out there that have done it on the speaker circuit, written books and write articles and do speaking engagements that a young person that wants to change how they farm or learn how to farm this way can find help. In that era, mid-90s, I thought I was the only one on the planet that was moving away from the industrial model. That's before the internet was available to me. And if it wasn't on a farm show on TV, I didn't know about it, or in a farm magazine. So I thought I was the only one on the planet moving in that direction. In retrospect, I was not. And more recently, some of us have gotten together that were doing it in that era. I'll say this, there weren't many people in that era that were moving away from it, but there were some.
What did you actually do?
What I actually did was to cease doing things that were displeasing to me. I ceased to use hormone implants and subtherapeutic antibiotics and ionophores on my cattle. I ceased to feed them in a corn-based ration, a grain ration in confinement. I turned them loose in open pastures and to graze them. I ceased using chemical fertilizers and pesticides on my crops and my pastures. I gave up fairly abruptly the technologies that science had given me to increase the production on my farm.
Now, once you decided to do that, and when other people decide to do it as well, that transition is not smooth and easy. It's not instantaneous. What were some of the first consequences of getting off all of those chemicals and grain feed?
Well, the big consequence was I went from making money to losing money.
Right.
And it didn't happen overnight, but I did. I was blessed and I inherited a paid-for farm and no debt. Otherwise, it would not have been possible. But I was raising the product I was producing back then was American grass-fed beef, which I later got a premium for. But that market had not started to develop in the mid-90s.
Right.
So I was selling it as commodity beef at commodity prices, but I was not producing as much of it. I was not producing it as fast. I had more cost in it. So it pushed me from making money to losing money. And I would have gone broke. I would have gone broke. The wonderful news for me was that, quite coincidentally, this is when sophisticated consumers first started focusing on grass-fed beef. Prior to that era, I didn't know. I don't think anybody was discussing grass-fed beef. I certainly wasn't part of any discussion. But when people started discussing it, it was exactly what I was producing. And I was, again, blessed, fortunate, whatever words you want to use, but I did recognize the opportunity, and I sold Whole Foods Market and Public Supermarket the first pound of American grass-fed beef that they marketed as American grass-fed beef. And the market was still small and nichey, but it was opening up and nobody had any. I mean, just almost no one was producing it. And I was producing a lot. So we did really well for a while. We had some really, really, really good years. It eventually, that market eventually kind of went the other way, but we did well for a while.
Still, you described this world in which the deck is really stacked against independent farmers. Even somebody like you who's, as you say, you inherited land that was paid for, so you're a step ahead, but there's still a lot of challenges, and the big meat producers really didn't like people like you getting into the market.
Well, at first they didn't care much. They came to not like it, but at that time, I don't think they took it very seriously. Let's don't confuse being bold with being naive. In retrospect, what I did was bold, but at the time it was pretty much just naivety. I mean, I didn't, I inherited a paid-for farm. I'd operated profitably for 20 years. I didn't make a lot of money, but it was profitable. I made some money every year. When cattle were cheap, I made a little bit. When cattle were high, we did pretty well. And when I became disgusted with that production model and decided to move over to something else, I don't think I ever really considered the fact that I would lose money. I think I just thought I'd do it different. But the result was we had money losing years.
Let's go back to the land and the animals for a moment. How long did it take for the system, for the farm, to really get back in balance? And what does that look like? I mean, you described this second kind of epiphany where you were looking at the soil in the wild area on your land and then the soil on the grazed area, and you had a moment where you're like, hang on, one soil is a whole lot better than the other. Eventually, the whole system got into balance.
Is getting into balance, yes.
Yeah.
So the animal welfare was the first thing that hit me as being wrong with what I was doing, but it was followed very quickly by the environmental impact of farming industrially. And the instance you're talking about is I was becoming aware of the harm I was doing to my land over and above what I was doing to the animals, and noticed walking in the woods, my woods, that the earth was very different from what it was just a few yards away out in the field. It wasn't a soil type difference, notably. It was the way the land was being managed. The land that I had been using intense tillage, intense fertilization, chemical fertilization, and intense use of pesticide, was just quite literally a dead mineral medium. And I could see it. I didn't until I looked for it, but when I looked for it, I could see it as a dead mineral medium. It's like a parking lot. And just a few yards away in the forest, it was nice. It was loamy. There were a lot of creatures living in it. I could see. I knew there was a lot living there I couldn't see. And it held moisture. It was just a lovely medium as compared to what I was farming. And the only difference is the way I was managing it. So I just started managing it differently and was convinced that it would make an impact, and it did. But I must say I was very shocked, disappointed, surprised at how long it took. It doesn't happen overnight. The life in soil is not degraded instantly, and it's not replenished instantly. It takes time. And during that time, it's less productive than we want it to be, and therefore less profitable.
You write about there were the churchgoers, and then there were the lowlifes, and then there were the Harrises. But you write about not being a churchgoer, but having this kind of spirituality rooted in the land. And it seems like what you're doing is really an expression of that.
Well, I think it is. The quote you're looking for is that people around here have said for years, and I heard it as a kid, that there are three kind of people. There's good people that go to church, and there's bad people that don't go to church, and there's the Harrises. And it was true. My people didn't go to church, and in the Bible Belt, the Southern Bible Belt, where most people go to church, and if you didn't go to church, it was expected that you were a ne'er-do-well that whatever did not live a very good life. But we farmed, we hired people, we paid our bills, we were fairly leaders in the community. So that was always odd. But what I always understood is that my dad, my granddad, probably before that, were quite spiritual people. They just weren't churchy. Their spirituality was tied to nature in the field as opposed to in that white building in town.
In this book, you really take us for a ride through the whole process of conversion to a grass-fed, grass-finished farm, and we'll get in a moment to the other things that you're producing on the farm too. But one of the things that's just really, I don't know, entertaining, educational, interesting about it is you take us for this trip and how it's so much the opposite of the industrial path where everything is laid out for you. You do this, you do that. You had to invent every single thing as you were going along. And, it wasn't just a skill set, but it was like having a fighting spirit. It seems, and you say at a certain point, it's like, I get up every morning and find something that pisses me off and fight it. It seems like that is just a part of going into that independent direction that you chose.
Well, the difference in mindset that you mentioned is pretty profound. The in industrial monocultural production is a very intentionally linear model. The post-World War II, my dad's generation made food production very linear. They did that by making it very monocultural. And as compared to what my great-granddad and granddad did on this farm, which was very, very cyclical, not linear. Theirs was very cyclical. My dad's was very linear. And that was done by design. It was done to adapt the factory model and apply it to agriculture. A factory is so linear. It's just, it comes in one end as a raw material. I don't care what you're making, I don't care what manufacturing plant it is. On one end is raw material, and it goes through whatever processes are necessary. It comes out the other end as a finished product. Very linear. A farm is a living system and is meant to be very cyclical. I could talk about that all day, and I don't know if you understand. I hope you understand what I mean by that. But there were reasons why we made the farm very linear. My people believed, and many, many, many people still believe, it's because it was so much more efficient. That efficiency comes primarily from spinning off costs. It doesn't come from it being actually more efficient in the manufacturing process or the growing, producing process. An example I use is the Gulf of Mexico is about 80 or 90 miles downstream from my farm. I'm in Southwest Georgia. And the Gulf of Mexico used to be a thriving oyster producing region. But they have banned wild oyster harvest down there because there's a huge dead area that's dead because of the pesticides and chemical fertilizers that have washed down the Chattahoochee River to the Apalachicola River to Apalachicola Bay. That is an unintended consequence of farming industrially, taking cost out of production And it did take cost out of production, but it moved those costs into another area where the farmers nor the pesticide producers paid for it, nor the people that bought the food have to pay for it. So it's not a real economy. It's just a moving of cost. And we're talking about the polar ice caps thawing, talk about the species becoming endangered. We can talk about many things, pollution, plastics everywhere. We can talk about many things that are real costs of industrial food production, but you don't pay them when you buy the hamburger.
Somewhere in the book, you talk about efficiency versus resiliency. And when you go to the industrial model, you lose resiliency. And that is something that doesn't get accounted for right away. It might get accounted for down the road when we reach a catastrophic moment. But talk about the resiliency piece of it.
So I think that efficiency and resiliency is yin and yang, the opposite. The more efficient you become, the less resilient you become. You build a tower higher and higher and higher, but the taller you build it, the more likely it is to eventually fall over. And what we do here is very resilient. It's not as efficient. Let's be clear. The beef and pork and lamb and eggs and vegetables that I produce here cost more than those produced in a monocultural industrial production model. It just does. I got to get more for it or I can't be in business. Now, I don't spin off a lot of costs that model spins off, but I do incur those costs.
I mean, this is the thing. Okay, people talk about it's cheaper, but as you say, it's not really cheaper because when you're eating food that's bad for you, there are increased health costs. When taxpayers have to clean up pollution, there's increased taxes. I mean, it all comes out. This is called true cost accounting. Like if you look at the real cost of food and the big monopolistic corporate food barons. In our last podcast, we literally did a show on a book called Barons, which was about the kind of robber barons of the food system. They want to keep it in that industrial model. You had a guy on the farm named Cole Allen, and he did a true accounting of your farm. What did that show? What was that? What was that whole thing?
So Cole Allen is great. Cole Allen was a very successful young real estate guy in Washington, D.C., who had some health issues and found health by eating food that was raised more properly and decided he wanted to make that his life's work and went on a journey to visit regenerative farms all over the country, all over the world, actually. But one of the places he came was here, and he and I kind of fell in love with each other. And I wound up hiring him on a consulting basis. He actually worked here for a while. It was just temporary to learn something about the farm. Ultimately, I hired him on a consulting basis to do projects for us. And he analyzed costs of food production and just all kind of different scenarios to find out what really lowered the cost of food. And it was shocking how much food ought to cost. We're just eating way too cheap. And nobody wants to hear that. And it bothers me. It bothers me to be a part of the leadership that is promoting a production model that I know will increase the cost of food. I'm as concerned about poor people who can't afford to pay more for food as anyone else. But something's got to be done because of the incredible damage we're doing raising this artificially cheap food. And Cole did that with several different examples in his work, and that work is in my book.
Yeah, I would recommend that everybody who's listening to this show, if you're going to read one book about regenerative agriculture this year, this is the one, because it goes into such depth about that, about, the true cost accounting and, all the other stories of what's going on your farm. And I mean, one of the things that you're doing is you went from just grazing cattle to having other pieces of your business and selling a whole bunch of other products. What are the other things that are coming from your farm, and talk about them in terms of the resiliency of the overall picture?
I will. It was a monocultural cattle farm. The only product we had to market was beef, and the only crop that we grew, the primary crop we grew, was Tifton 85 Bermuda grass. And I was really happy with that, and I thought I was really good at it. But for all the reasons we discussed earlier, I changed my mind and decided to give up all those tools that increase production. And when I did, my operation started falling apart because, and I didn't at the time, I didn't realize it, I do now, is because I was operating as a monoculture. My only animals were cattle. My only plants was a specific Bermuda grass, and I maintain a monoculture of both. If you were a bug or any species living in my grass or on my cattle, I use pesticides to get rid of you. And every day I woke up and went to the pasture and looked for something to kill. And I was very good at it. Pesticide. Side means kill. Herbicide, insecticide, fungicide. We can go on to homicide.
Right.
Side means kill. And I was looking for something to kill, and I was really, really good at it. And as a result, I had a great monoculture of cattle grazing a great monoculture of grass. And I thought it was beautiful. And when I gave up using the sides and quit looking for something to kill, my operation fell apart. All kinds of other weeds came up in my pasture, and the cows didn't want them. So we solved that by adding sheep and later goats and later hogs and later rabbits, and it worked. And we went from a monoculture and me looking for something to kill to a polyculture and me looking for a way to keep things alive. A very radically different approach, and it's something I'm still learning about, still mastering. I got to tell you, the cattle is still my favorite species. That's what I really, in the afternoons when I go to the pasture to relax and drink a glass of wine, I go to cow pasture, not the hog pasture or the goat pasture, the sheep pasture. But all those species are necessary to operate this polycultural system that is productive and turns the cycles of nature into an abundance.
And I think what's striking, and you write about this, is that it's harder. It's not like the factory model, you do this, you do that, step 1, step 2, step 3. This is a much more subtle and difficult and trial and error kind of farming.
It's more complex. I don't think it's harder. It's more complex, more complexity. As we discussed earlier, we had reduced monocultural farming to such a linear, straight line path. And that was done on purpose. It made it easier to teach. I told you I went to the University of Georgia, and there I learned soils from soils professors. They didn't know anything about animals. And I learned animal science from specialists. One knew about nutrition, one knew about reproduction, one knew about whatever else. And that's all they knew about. And the plant guys were the same way, and those were my professors as well. So in that linear educational model, we learn about the different fields from experts who know an incredible amount about a very narrow segment of the production model. the old saying is, they know more and more about less and less.
Right.
And that's not meant to be, and that's true, but it's not meant to be derogatory. These are brilliant people, but all they know is that one narrow discipline. And that's not the way this complex system that I own operates. It is necessary for me to know a little bit about all of it, and impossible to know all there is about any of it. And another thing about that, take that one step further. One of the things that you will note, in these university specialists is they may be an entomologist in Georgia one year, and then they may be in Arizona, and then they may be in Oregon, and then they may be in Maine. They're always entomologists, but they move all over the country, all over the world. And that too does not agree with my current beliefs. I think that the cycles of nature, we can talk more about that, are the same everywhere. But in each ecosystem, it manifests itself differently. You don't farm, you don't operate a farm the same way in the deep South as you do in the upper Midwest, that you would in the far West, as you would in New England. It's very different ecosystems. The same cycles of nature, the same energy cycle, water cycle, microbial cycle, mineral cycle, ... But they manifest themselves differently. And you can be an expert in farming here and not be very good at farming not too far from here.
One of the things that you talk about, and there's a kind of a series of conversations with the anti-meat eating faction that is very vocal in this country and around the world, you talk about really loving the herd. And that doesn't mean loving individual animals as if they were house pets, but really loving this kind of bigger picture of this herd that keeps reproducing itself. It's different paradigms. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's something I really struggled with when I was making my change from an industrial cattleman to doing what I do now. I would be in a food show somewhere, or a place where I was around my sophisticated consumers and really nice people, and they would say, "I'm going to buy your product. I'm going to support you. I really like what you're doing with the land. But I got to tell you, I just don't know how you can raise an animal, see it born, raise it, and slaughter it and kill it and eat it. I just don't see how you can do that." And it always took me by surprise. I heard that not just one time. I heard that it was not unusual to be told that. And they weren't trying to be cruel or hard. They just didn't understand how they believed I was a nice guy. They didn't see how I could do that. And it was as unbelievable to me as it was to them. I didn't understand why that was hard for them to grasp. And I had to think about it a lot, and I did, but I figured it out. And what I figured out is, I am a very simple man. I'm not a complex person. I'm just not. But when it comes to my relationship with animals, I've got a lot of complexity because of my background. These really complex, sophisticated consumers that I was talking to are not complex when it comes to animal relationships. They're very simple. And the only animal relationship they had ever had was the relationship with their dog or cat or bird or whatever pet they had. And they understandably didn't see how you could kill it and skin it and gut it and eat it. And I don't either. I got a dog, and I feel the same way about my dog that they feel about theirs. But I have a very complex relationship with my animals. I have a relationship with my pet, my dog. That'd be very just like you would have with yours or they would have with theirs. I've got a relationship with my food animals, cows, sheep, and goats. It's very different. I love my herd. I don't love the individual in the herd. I love calving season or lambing season or farrowing season when all the babies are being born. And I love the herd as they're growing up. And I look forward to slaughtering them to make room for the next birth. And that's the way it works. That's the way the system works. I don't love the individual. I love the group. And I mean, I especially love it because it is a perpetual form of wealth and livelihood and life for my farm. And I go on and on. It's perpetual. It'll last forever. This farm's 150 something years old, and we still have a herd of cows. They had a herd of cows 150 years ago. And if my children and grandchildren continue, there'll still be a herd of cows 150 years from now. It's perpetual, and that's beautiful. Now, the individual animal is not sacred to me. And I can go on. I have a relationship with my pet. I have a relationship with my stock animals, I just said. I got a relationship with the wildlife on the farm that's very different. A relationship with the bees, birds. Every species that lives here has a role, and it's important, but nothing is perpetual, including me and you and all those individual animals in that herd.
Well, I mean, I think part of the love for the herd that you talk about, even if it's not a love for the individuals, you treat the individuals very well, make sure that they have good lives where they can express their own instincts and that they have a humane death.
Well, the fact that I'm obligated to give them as high a quality of life as I can, and the fact that I intend to slaughter them one day are very different. I mean, both of them are true, but one doesn't impact the other. I used to believe when I was an industrial farmer that good animal welfare meant you kept the animals well fed, you kept them watered, you kept them in a comfortable temperature range, and you didn't intentionally inflict pain and suffering on them. And if you did that, that was good animal welfare. You had checked all the boxes. And I have come to believe that that is not good animal welfare. Good animal welfare includes all those things, but it also means that it's incumbent upon me to create an environment in which the animal can express instinctive behavior. Pigs were born to root and wallow. Cows were born to roam and graze. Chickens were born to scratch and peck, ... But in the industrial confinement model, those animals can't do that. Right. A hog can't root and wallow on a concrete slab. So good animal welfare to me means you got to create the opportunity for them to express instinctive behavior. Now, I know when they're born, I'm going to slaughter them, and I'm unapologetic for that. But I will create a good life for them. I will select breeding animals to follow them, and I will slaughter them as humanely as I possibly can. And I will eat and distribute for others to eat the meat that comes from. And I'm really unapologetic about that.
And that is healthy meat. And so you're nourishing many, many people who are eating this as opposed to industrial food, which is not nearly as good for you or the land.
I think it's a noble way to make a living. As I mentioned earlier, there are cycles of nature that we break in the industrial farming model. I mentioned earlier, there's the energy cycle from the sun, the water cycle from the rain, the microbial cycle in the soil, the carbon cycle, on and on. And those cycles, when allowed to operate optimally, produce an abundance. And that abundance is the only wealth that exists. And that's what we live on. That's what I market as a farmer. And the industrial model intentionally breaks the cycles of nature. It separates out those cycles I just mentioned. And when that happens, it does not produce the abundance of nature that that is supposed to happen. It produces something else that has unintended. It produces food, but it has unintended consequences to that production model.
And what you just said is really the essence of biodiversity, and biodiversity including animals, and this idea that you can take animals off the land and have that land thrive is something that you go into in the book. I also wanted to talk about human diversity, which you compare to biodiversity. I mean, you've put together an amazing team of people. Your two daughters work with you, their spouses, lots of other people, including a lot of young people who were coming back to agriculture. Talk about what that looks like at White Oak Pastures, and what that kind of human biodiversity does.
Yeah, so we say a lot about our model of production here that nature abhors a monoculture. I mentioned that earlier, and I stand by it. Industrial farming is purely monocultural. In the cornfield, there's nothing but corn. In the peanut field, there's nothing but peanuts. In the soybean field, there's nothing but soybeans. And anything else is out there, you kill it. And to a lesser extent, we've sort of done that on the farm. You can read a lot about how many farms are operated by white men and certainly by men and on and on. That's not what we do here. And it wasn't really all that intentional. I never woke up any morning and said, I'm going to make this a truly diverse place in terms of gender and ethnicity and whatever else. I didn't intentionally do that. But we do what we do, and we attract a certain kind of people, and the people come literally from all over the country. I could say all over the world. We've had kids here from South America and Turkey and other places, but certainly all over the country. And we embrace that, and we like it a lot. And the way my dad, granddad, great granddad ran this farm is, as young men, they hired young men to help them as employees. And they all grew old together. And then another generation would take over and hire young men. And I did the same thing. I took over and hired young men to help me. And it's certainly not the way it's worked out. Of course, my two daughters came back. And one of my daughters is gay, but both daughters' partner came with them. And we've got a lot of different people of a lot of different ethnicities, and it's great. And we don't have employees that will stay here for 30 years like my dad, granddad, great-granddad. These people come and go, but it's wonderful. They're smart people that come here to learn. We have an internship program. We bring 6 interns in per quarter, 4 times a year. If I do say so myself, it's a good program. I created it really to kind of run people off or give them a reason to not come here, but it's worked out beautifully and got great employees from it. And we've got another program. I formed a nonprofit, a 501c3 called CFAR, Center for Agricultural Resilience. And we have sessions here pretty much monthly where people come to learn for 2 or 3 days. And it's not profitable, but it's a lot of fun to have that kind of knowledge dissemination. And I think it's good for our business here.
I think the third epiphany in the book happened when you kind of looked around at your town of Bluffton, Georgia, and realized that it was really in a state of decline. Your farm has been instrumental in kind of revitalizing Bluffton, and you talk about the importance of rural revitalization.
Yeah, that still kind of takes my breath away. As I told you earlier, I made the change focused on the land and the animals. I really wanted to operate differently with regard to how I treated my land, how I treated the animals. And the town was not in the equation. The town is Bluffton, Georgia. Bluffton was formed in 1815, which is very, very old. We can talk about that a lot. But it's very old for this part of the world. Not New England, but for the deep South, it's very old. Bluffton peaked in population in 1900 with about 400 people. And that doesn't sound like a lot, it's not. But Bluffton was a trade center for a lot of 40-acre farms that surrounded it. And in that era, every 40-acre farm would have had a family. And the family probably would have had 10 or 12 people because it was big, a lot of children back then, and probably grandparents would have been, living grandparents would have been there. So Bluffton was a trade center for several thousand people, and it was very successful. Even when I was born in 1954, and even when I was growing up, there was a doctor, there was a bank, there was several stores, but it was certainly, even then, in decline. It went in decline post-World War II, like most of rural America did. And by the time I got back to the farm operating it, it was pretty much a ghost town, and it's on its way to being completely a ghost town. And it didn't bother me much. It wasn't that I didn't care. It's just that it had been in decline all my life. And so we changed the way we farm. And by the way, we got 170 employees now. And I'm not proud of what I pay them, but they make well above the county average. I'm the largest private employer in the county, and payroll is $100,000 every Friday. And the town has changed because of that. And it wasn't intentional on my part, but it just has. And I had a visitor here 10 years ago, and we were talking, happened to be standing in Bluffton talking, and he said, "This is a nice little town." And I smiled and looked at him, waiting on the punchline, and he meant it. And I looked around and said, it is. And it was becoming a nice town. And now I'm very proud. We have bought just about every house and lot and store that's sold in this town in the last 15 to 20 years. And we've tried to fix them up. We got a lot of employee housing. When I started changing the town, the only thing you could buy in Bluffton was a postage stamp. And the post office was open about an hour or two a day. And today we've got a store, a restaurant, an RV park, a lot of houses that people live in. There's a lot of things here, and it's still a tiny little town. It's real nice. You ought to come see us.
I would love to come down there. And reading your book, it makes you want to go and see what it's like. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about this is you are providing an example of what it looks like to share the wealth rather than hoarding it. And as you say, this is the model of regenerative ranching and farming that you're doing. It's not necessarily infinitely scalable. You're not going to gobble up all the land around you from, in 2 counties and 3 and 4, but it's infinitely replicable. And in that model of a replicable system, a lot of different people can do what you're doing, and each of them has a thriving way of making a good living, but not getting super rich. And I think that's so important to talk about and to think about, because it's a really different paradigm than this sort of corporate monopoly thing that we've been stuck with for a while.
I'm really glad you brought that up. The fact that what we're doing here is highly replicatable, but not highly scalable. And that gets back again, I know I keep going back to it, but the fact that we are very cyclical, but not linear. Linear businesses are very scalable. Just think about any big business in any industry you want to. It's been scaled up because it's very linear. Businesses like mine that are highly cyclical get a certain size, and after that, they lose efficiency. We currently have 170 employees, sell $20-something million worth of product a year, and have no desire to get any bigger. I didn't want to be this big. And I don't want there to be a white oak pastures in every state in the union, but I want there to be a white oak pastures like business in every farming community in the country. I want there to be more and more of us, and I don't want to own it. I don't want to manage it. I don't have any part of it. I just want that to be the way we run our agriculture in this country, and I think it's better. It's the cyclical model, not the linear model. It builds, doesn't destroy. It's highly resilient, not highly scalable. All these things we've been talking about. During the pandemic, we'll talk about that in 1 second. During the pandemic, the grocery store shelves were empty in many cases. Most of the big major meat companies had to have a hiatus. A lot of confinement farm animals were sacrificed, slaughtered. At White Oak Pastures, we never missed a day. We never missed a day. Every single day, we fed our animals. We hauled our animals that were ready to our slaughter plant. We slaughtered them. The employees went home that night and came back the next morning. Never missed a day.
And that's the true resilience.
That's resilience.
Well, there's so much more we could talk about. Like, you have a whole chapter devoted to your work with a solar energy company that was putting in an installation of panels near you and getting them to do livestock grazing instead of mowing and spraying. That's another replicable model that I hope people learn from you. But there's one more thing I did want to talk with you about, and that is, a while back, you wrote an open letter to Bill Gates, who has bought a ton of farmland around the country, and you basically said you're about as good as, running a farm as I would be running a high-tech company. What was that about, and did you ever hear from him?
I heard from some of his people for a while, and then they went silent. I've read a lot of stuff about Bill Gates. I don't know any more about him than anybody else. I know there's a lot of criticism about him. I'm not critical. I don't know the gentleman. But I do know a little bit about the way he runs his farms, and it's very industrial, very monocultural, and I think that's very wrong. And I wanted him to consider a different way of doing it. And it kind of got in a little bit of a urinating contest. But I'm not here to criticize Bill Gates. I'm here to criticize the way he's managing his land. And I think it's a shame that he, who has all those resources and could be a real element of change in the way we produce food in the country, so embraces that factory monocultural model. I think it's a shame. And it was not my goal to scold him. My goal was to get him to educate himself, or let me help educate me and others, not just me, educate him on what I'm convinced is a better way of doing it. And that didn't go anywhere.
Will Harris, anything else you would like to let us know before we go?
There's just a lot we could talk about that I really
we could talk all day.
Yeah. I appreciate you having me on your show. Thank you very much. And again, I invite you and your listeners to come to visit us. I think we really enjoy having guests here. We have lodging for people to come and stay, and dining for them to come to eat. And it's not Disney World, but I'm very proud of what we do and love having people come to see it.
And we'll connect to your website in the show notes. It's whiteoakpastures.com. What's it like? Like, if I were to come down there and stay, like, would I get to, see the farm and how you're working?
Yeah, there are things you can sign up for. There's not perpetual tours, but they have them regularly. We got horses. They have horseback riding, and then we have not every day, but we do have events in schools and training sessions, and we just had a real big one this past weekend with the nonprofit CFAR, and that I mentioned earlier, and we had about 70 people here, which is a really big crowd for us. That's kind of the top end of where we need to be.
Will Harris, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Mary Charlotte. I appreciate being on.
You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.